He told the dispatcher it was an accident, a struggle, a gun going off between them. But the woman he called for help was found alone, inside a closet, seriously injured. And the gun he said they fought over wasn't on the floor. It wasn't near either of them. It was sitting on the nightstand, untouched, undisturbed. If two people were really struggling over that weapon, how did it end up there? That question sits at the center of everything you're about to hear. Welcome to Her Last Chapter. Today, we're breaking down the murder of Tammy Rena Dawson, a case built on one man's version of events, and a crime scene that told a very different story. Stay with us until the end. Subscribe, hit the like button, and tell us where you're watching from. Hartfield Lane sits in West Beaumont, Texas, a quiet residential block off Gladys near Major Drive. Houses set back from the street, driveways instead of sidewalks. The kind of neighborhood where people mind their own business, because there's rarely a reason not to. That changed in the early hours of June 6, 2026. At 2:40 in the morning, a man inside one of those homes picked up his phone and dialed 911. His name was Brandon Chrétien. He was 44 years old. He told the dispatcher he was in a relationship with the woman inside the house. Her name was Tammy Rena Dawson. She was 25. Chrétien said the two of them had gotten into a physical struggle over a handgun. He said the gun discharged during that struggle. He said Tammy had been shot. It's worth pausing on that phrasing, because it's the exact story this entire case would eventually be measured against. Not an argument that turned violent, not a moment of anger. According to Chrétien, this was an accident. Two people, one gun, and a discharge that neither of them intended. Police and EMS were dispatched immediately. When officers arrived at the home, they found Tammy inside a bedroom closet, suffering from a gunshot wound. Not in the bedroom itself, not near a doorway, inside the closet. She was rushed to the hospital in critical condition. But almost immediately, something about the scene didn't add up. The handgun Chrétien described wasn't on the floor. It wasn't near the closet. It wasn't in any position that suggested two people had just been fighting over it. It was sitting on the bedside table, off to the side, in place. Think about what a genuine struggle over a weapon actually looks like. Two people grabbing for the same object, pulling, resisting. In that kind of moment, a gun doesn't usually end up set down gently on a piece of furniture. It ends up dropped, knocked aside, somewhere on the floor, somewhere close to whoever was holding it last. For a struggle to end the way Chrétien described it, that gun should have told a different story. A weapon involved in a physical fight between two people doesn't usually end up resting quietly on a nightstand. So investigators were left with a question they couldn't ignore. If the version of events was true, if this really was two people wrestling for control of a firearm, then how did that firearm end up untouched, set down, and left exactly where a person places something on purpose? That question would define the next stage of this investigation. Because what Brandon Chrétien told the dispatcher that night, and what Beaumont police were about to find as they processed that house, were already starting to pull in two very different directions. And in cases like this, that gap between what a suspect says and what the evidence shows is very often where the truth ends up living. Before she became a case file, Tammy Rena Dawson was simply a woman from Beaumont, Texas. She was 25 years old, a mother, a daughter, a sister, someone with people who loved her, and a life that had nothing to do with what would happen to her on Hartfield Lane. She had a son. His name was Royal Armstrong. Her parents were Tamika Roberts and Tommy Dawson Jr. She had siblings too, a family that, as of that June morning, had no idea their world was about to change. The people who knew Tammy longest describe her the same way, even though they're not speaking to each other. Aaron Harris had known her since middle school. He remembered her as someone who gave more than she kept for herself. Mira Lee had known her even longer, since their days together at Odom Academy. Mira called her a sister, not just a friend. When she heard Tammy had been shot, she didn't wait for confirmation. She went straight to the hospital. That's the kind of bond people had with Tammy, the kind that doesn't wait to be asked. None of that mattered to the physical evidence being processed back on Hartfield Lane. None of it slowed down the investigation or changed what detectives were finding inside that house. The forensic process doesn't pause for grief. It moves forward on its own timeline, regardless of who's waiting on the outcome. But it matters here, because before any of this became a headline, a police report, or a name in a court filing, Tammy Dawson was a person other people counted on. A woman with a son who needed her, a daughter with parents who raised her, a friend who showed up for the people in her life, the same way they were now showing up for her. That's who was inside that house on Hartfield Lane. Not just a victim, a person with a name, a family, and people who are still asking why. If you want to understand how a story like this unravels, piece by piece, fact by fact, this is the kind of case we cover. Subscribe now so you don't miss how the evidence in this case finally caught up with Brandon Chrétien's story. The house on Hartfield Lane was not a shared home. It belonged to Brandon Chrétien. Tammy Dawson was there that night as his girlfriend, according to what he told police. But how she came to be there, how long the two of them had actually been together, or what happened earlier that evening, before that 2:40 a.m. phone call, is not something that's been made public. There's no documented account of an argument, no record of a call for help before that night, no prior complaint on file that's been released. If something led up to what happened inside that house, the public record doesn't show it, at least not yet. That silence in the record isn't nothing. In a lot of domestic violence cases, the public only learns about a pattern after the worst has already happened. Whether that's true here, or whether this really was an isolated night, is something this case still hasn't answered. What is known is the age gap between them. Chrétien was 44. Dawson was 25, 19 years apart. Researchers who study intimate partner violence have long pointed to relationships with a significant age or power gap as ones where control can take root more easily, and where leaving can feel more complicated than it looks from the outside. The person with more years, more resources, more established footing often holds more control over the relationship's terms, without that control ever being named out loud. There's another detail worth noting. In later reporting on this case, Tammy was referred to not as Chrétien's girlfriend, but as his ex-girlfriend. Estranged. Whether that shift happened days before the shooting or only came out afterward in the language used by investigators is something this case still hasn't answered publicly. And one more fact, stated plainly, because it matters. As of this recording, there is no public record of a prior criminal history for Brandon Chrétien, no earlier arrests tied to his name, no documented warning signs on paper, which means everything the public knows about who Brandon Chrétien was before June 6, 2026, starts and ends with what happened inside that house that night. When Beaumont police arrived on Hartfield Lane, they didn't just find a woman who had been shot. They found a man standing in his own home, already on the phone, already talking. Officers took Chrétien into custody at the scene. Not later, not after questioning, right there while EMS was still working to get Tammy out of the house. And from the very first minutes of that response, Beaumont police classified what they were looking at as domestic violence. Not a shooting under investigation, a domestic violence case from the moment the first officer walked through that door. That classification matters because it wasn't based on a guess. It was based on what the responding officers were already seeing: the position of the body, the state of the room, the absence of anything that pointed to a genuine struggle having taken place where Chrétien said it did. Experienced officers develop an instinct for scenes that don't match the story they're being told. It's not proof on its own, but it's often the first sign that an investigation is about to go somewhere the initial phone call didn't suggest. Tammy was rushed by ambulance to a hospital in Southeast Texas in critical condition, fighting for her life. Chrétien stayed behind, detained. Held for questioning, while behind him, his house was about to be turned into a crime scene. Because what happened next wasn't quick. It wasn't a 5-minute look around. It was the beginning of hours of work. Hours that would end up deciding whether Brandon Chrétien's story could survive contact with the evidence. For the next several hours, Beaumont's Criminal Investigations Division and Crime Scene Unit worked that house on Hartfield Lane inch by inch. They photographed every surface: the bedroom, the closet, the bedside table, the distances between them. They collected evidence from the floor, the walls, the furniture, anything that could confirm or contradict what Chrétien had told the dispatcher. This is the part of an investigation that rarely makes headlines, but it's the part that actually decides a case. Not the 911 call, not the arrest, the measurements, the photographs. The documentation of exactly where every object was found, because in a case built on someone's word against a physical scene, those details are what either back up a suspect's account or tear it apart. At one point, officers even called Beaumont Animal Care to the scene to remove a small dog that had been inside the home. A quiet, almost unremarkable detail, but it says something about how thoroughly that house was being processed. Nothing was overlooked. Everything had to be accounted for, down to the family pet. While the physical scene was being documented, investigators were also building the paper trail. A probable cause affidavit, the sworn account of what law enforcement found, was signed off by Magistrate Mark DeRuin. That document, later obtained by local station KFDM, would become the clearest public record of how Chrétien's story and the physical evidence stopped lining up. Point by point, the affidavit laid it out. The position of the gun, the nature of Tammy's injury, the lack of anything at the scene consistent with two people physically struggling over a weapon. Investigators reached a conclusion, and they didn't soften it. What Tammy suffered was not consistent with an accidental discharge during a mutual struggle. The evidence indicated Chrétien had fired the weapon himself. That's not speculation. That's what law enforcement stated, based on forensic analysis of the scene before Tammy had even died. It's worth being clear here about what hasn't been made public. There's no released, detailed autopsy report beyond this finding. No public breakdown of exact trajectory or distance. What is documented, clearly and on the record, is the core conclusion investigators reached. This was not an accident. That conclusion didn't come from a hunch. It came from hours of methodical work, the kind that doesn't get faster just because a family is waiting at a hospital for news. It came from officers and forensic personnel treating every inch of that house as a potential answer to the one question that mattered most. Did this happen the way Brandon Chrétien said it did? Which meant that as Tammy fought for her life in a hospital bed, the case against the man who called himself her boyfriend was already taking shape, one piece of evidence at a time. Tammy was taken to St. Elizabeth Hospital, where doctors were working to save her life. Her injury was severe, a traumatic brain injury that left her in critical condition. In the hours and days that followed, her condition didn't improve. She slipped into a vegetative state. Her family gathered at her bedside, her parents, her son, the people who loved her, doing the only thing left to do, staying close, while doctors worked to determine if there was anything more that could be done. There wasn't. On the morning of June 8, 2026, with her family present, Tammy Rena Dawson was removed from life support. She was pronounced dead that day. Up until that moment, the case against Brandon Chrétien had been building on one specific legal foundation: the belief that Tammy might survive. Once she didn't, everything about the charges against him was about to change. Because in the eyes of the law, the moment Tammy died, this stopped being a case about injury. It became a case about a killing. While Tammy was still alive and fighting in the hospital, prosecutors had to work with what the law allowed at that point. Brandon Chrétien was formally charged with aggravated assault with a deadly weapon causing serious bodily injury, a first-degree felony. A magistrate, Richard Hughes, set his bond at $1 million. Conditions came with it. If Chrétien were to be released, he'd be required to wear a GPS monitor. He was barred from possessing any firearms or ammunition, and he was prohibited from having any contact with witnesses in the case. It's important to understand why the charge was written the way it was. Under Texas law, prosecutors build charges around the facts as they stand in that exact moment. And in that moment, Tammy was still alive, injured, in critical condition, but alive. That single fact shaped everything about how the justice system was legally allowed to respond, at least for now. It's a detail that frustrates a lot of people watching cases like this unfold in real time. The charge on paper doesn't always match the severity of what actually happened. It matches what the law permits at that exact stage, nothing more, nothing less. Chrétien was booked into the Jefferson County Correctional Facility, held on that $1 million bond, while the investigation around him kept moving. Because everyone involved, the detectives, the prosecutors, even the people who loved Tammy, understood the same uncomfortable truth. The charge on paper could change overnight. And it did. The day Tammy died, everything shifted. Prosecutors moved to upgrade the case. What had been aggravated assault became something far more serious. A Jefferson County grand jury reviewed the evidence that had already been building since that first night on Hartfield Lane. The forensic findings, the affidavit, the contradiction between Chrétien's account and what investigators found at the scene. The grand jury returned an indictment for murder. Under Texas law, a murder conviction carries a sentence ranging from 5 years up to life in prison. One detail from later court reporting stands out. Where earlier coverage referred to Tammy as Chrétien's girlfriend, the indictment reporting referred to her as his ex-girlfriend. Estranged. That word shift is on the public record, even if the full story behind it isn't. As for where this case stands right now, Brandon Chrétien remains in custody at the Jefferson County Correctional Facility, held on a murder charge, with bonds still set at $1 million. As of this recording, no trial date has been set, which means the story of what happened inside that house on Hartfield Lane hasn't reached its conclusion. It's still being written inside a courtroom that hasn't opened its doors on this case yet. For a case built almost entirely on the gap between one man's story and what the evidence showed, the trial itself will likely come down to that exact gap, laid out in front of a jury. Cases like Tammy's don't exist in isolation. In Texas, aggravated assault was the second most common family violence offense reported in 2025. And the majority of those incidents happened exactly where you'd least expect danger to live, inside the home. Advocates who work with survivors every day say the same thing, again and again. Control rarely announces itself. It doesn't usually start with a weapon. It starts smaller. Isolation from family, isolation from friends, a slow narrowing of who someone is allowed to talk to and who's allowed to see what's really happening behind closed doors. By the time a situation becomes visible to the outside world, in a lot of cases, it's already been building for months, sometimes years, out of sight. That's part of why the word used in later reporting on this case, estranged, carries weight. Because law enforcement and researchers who study domestic violence homicide have long identified one period as the most dangerous point in an abusive relationship, the time right after someone tries to leave, or is believed to be leaving. It's a pattern that shows up again and again in cases like this one. The moment a victim starts to pull away is very often the moment the risk increases, not decreases, contrary to what a lot of people assume. Whether that applies here is something a jury will eventually have to weigh, but it's part of the pattern this case sits inside. Family Services of Southeast Texas has spoken publicly since Tammy's death, using her case to reach anyone who might be living through something similar right now. Their message has been consistent. It is never too late to reach out, and no one has to wait for a situation to become unsurvivable before asking for help. On June 27, 2026, Tammy Rena Dawson was laid to rest at Starlight Missionary Baptist Church in Beaumont. Family and friends gathered, the same people who had spent weeks grieving in public and in private, to say goodbye. As it stands today, Brandon Chrétien remains behind bars, indicted for murder, awaiting a trial date that hasn't yet been set. What began as a phone call describing an accident is now a case that will be decided in a courtroom, based on evidence that never matched the story he gave that night. Tammy Dawson was 25 years old. She left behind a son, parents, siblings, and friends who are still telling her story so that she isn't reduced to a single headline. Here's what we want to know from you. Given that later reports referred to Tammy as Chrétien's estranged girlfriend, not his girlfriend, do you think that detail changes how this case should have been handled from the very first phone call? Let us know in the comments. If this case affected you the way it affected us, subscribe to this channel. We'll be following this one through to trial, and when a verdict comes, you'll hear it here first.